As a big Guilty Gear fan, a couple weeks ago I made Bridget's Bullet YoYo in Blender, which a lot of you liked. And one of the first comments I got was somebody saying they thought it was going to be in real life, which got me thinking, why don't I make my model in real life? Then I realised I didn't have a 3D printer, so I bought a 3D printer. Ouch. This was the first time I ever used one, so I knew there'd be a bit of a learning curve to it. I got the Anycubic Viper, which was relatively easy to set up. I saw this was a good choice to start off with, as the printer had auto leveling, which I've heard is a pain in the arse for some other printers. I also like the screen. With it set up and auto leveled, the first stage to creating this yo-yo was to create a butterfly knife. In all honesty, whilst it was just for the gimmick, it taught me how to use Cooler and learn how to slice my models correctly. It also taught me how the model should be packaged together so they can be distributed properly online. With this vital step out the way, it was time to actually start on the yo-yo. As I'd already made the model, I was convinced that the process of exporting it for an STL file would be simple. But I was wrong. If you don't know what poly counts and good topology is, basically, a 3D model is made up of vertices in 3D space that create up something called a mesh. These faces are made up of small triangles, and the more triangles you have, the more detail your model can have. As I've been studying game design for the last few years, we've been taught to keep this poly count low and use techniques such as height maps and retopology to try and keep it as low as possible. This is good practice when working with game engines specifically, as you can't have 2 million polygon sculpts running around with 8K textures because your game will not run and your PC will break. However, this doesn't apply to 3D printing because you want a higher poly count so that detail and quality can be transferred over into something real life. As my original model used shade smoothing to create this illusion of light and make the model look smooth, I'd have to actually subdivide the model in order to physically make it smooth. So I just click on the model, modifiers, subdivide surface, and... My model looks like it's just been pop busted. This is where I learned I needed to hold my edges. What this basically does is, it tells Blender that you want these edges to stay their shape, and then everything else you can subdivide. That's better. I then spent some time doing this for all parts of the model, making sure their try count was high, and also adding engravings for the detail. I then wanted to see a draft of the model, so I printed a low quality version of the top half. It looks bad, but it's progress. This also showed me I needed to add some clearance to some of the model because they wouldn't slot in correctly, so you'd have this big lump in the middle. After fixing this, it was time to print a higher resolution version. It looked nice, but most importantly, it fitted together. However, I didn't like the glossiness, and I also didn't like the colour. I originally planned to hand paint the whole thing, so sand down the model, prime it, paint it all red, but as I was doing this, I decided to print the model in different colour filaments. I'd then add the smaller details on by hand. So I bought some matte red, some grey, and everything went smooth from here, except it didn't. I had to change the filament over, which should have been like an easy process, considering the printer literally has a built-in feed-in, feed-out system, but there was something standing in the way. As I said previously, I've never owned a 3D printer, so I was quite unequipped when something like this happened because I didn't know how to fix it. When trying to extract the filament, it jammed in the feeder, and I spent hours trying to get it out. I dismantled the feeder, removed the motor attached to it, fed it back through, unfed it again, and nothing worked. I was then able to open the side of the feeder by completely removing the extruder tension screw. I cut the warped end from inside the feeder and then was able to finally pull it out. Here's the culprit. Anyway, I printed in matte red and the product was really nice. I liked the lack of gloss because the details came out well, and it also matched the source material quite well. Another learning curve I encountered was understanding the capabilities of a 3D printer. Unfortunately, they're not magic, and whilst they can do a lot of stuff, there is some stuff it just can't do. For example, 3D printers print from the bottom up in layers, and it struggles with overhangs because there's nothing to print them onto. And this is where supports come in. These are basically pieces of plastic which help support stuff like overhangs, and they work by being thinner and less adhered to the model, so they are easy to remove, but they still provide that platform for the overhangs to print on. These can be hard to remove, especially in tight areas, which is what I actually experienced in the lower half of the model when creating the gaps. I'd made the gaps too deep, which made the supports really hard to pull out cleanly. That meant I had to go back to Blender and remodel it so the gaps were closer to the edge, making the supports easier to come off. Everything was going fine and it was looking good until this happened. One night I had left my printer on and I was about to go to sleep when I decided to check the first layer of my print, and there were these weird wrinkles all over it. I hadn't changed a thing on my printer, so why now are my prints failing? I can't explain how frustrating this was for 4 days not knowing what the problem was. I changed the filament, I'd moved the spool closer to the feeder, I'd put supports under the legs of the printer, I took the printer off its stand, I printed over and over and over again, and nothing worked. Do you want to see what trial and error looks like? I then tried printing these small discs to see if it was something to do with the YoYo file itself. Huh? It worked, but the YoYo isn't. I then went into a Discord server for 3D printing and I asked if anyone knew what my issue was, and somebody said that the Z-axis was too low and that's what the wrinkles were. I then thought back to why my little discs were working, but nothing else was. And then I had a realization. The main difference between my discs and my YoYo part was the size. Maybe the bed was at an angle. I grabbed one of these, and what would you know, the print bed was at this sort of angle, and this was causing the prints to fail. I'm now going to show you the printer for 5 seconds, and I want you to tell me what's responsible for this. You see it? No? That's because it's these two nuts called the eccentric nuts, which can come loose after too much use. I tightened them and prayed. What was I greeted with? Perfect prints again. Great. With this, all I had to do was print the rest out, and then I could prepare them for painting. With these printing, I went to a Warhammer shop to pick up some paints. I chose White Scar, Corax White, Doorstone Grey, Abaddon Black, Lugganath Orange, and Deathclaw Brown. I then tested these paints on some failed prints to get some practice and see what I liked where. After some practice, I then applied these colours to the actual model. I've made a guide sheet to show you how to assemble the model and also where to paint it in case you want to make one yourself. I really like how the bullet casing came out because I made it with silk PLA, which is more shiny and makes it look more golden. With that, all that was left to do was to glue it together with some Gorilla Glue. You can also plastic weld this together, but I chose the glue. And after 2 weeks of work, a lot of trial and error, and a failing printer, here is Bridget's Bullet YoYo from Guilty Gear Strive. Thank you very much for watching. This was a ton of fun, and I hope to make more 3D props later on, so please consider subscribing and following my Twitter so you don't miss it. Also, yes, I'll be putting these on my Etsy store and my Booth store if you want to go make one yourself. Also, don't stress if you don't have your own printer, because there are companies like these two which you can send the files to. They will give you a quote, they'll then print on their own printers, and then they will send you them. I always appreciate the support heavily on these projects, so thank you if you do get one. Please also show me any cosplays you use this with, as I'd like to see them too. Anyways, thanks again for watching, and see ya.